So let's talk about Japan. Japan, for a very long time, has been wanting to become militarily independent from the Americans. And now Japan is pursuing another step towards that goal, and that is having the ability to attack land targets in China. Japan for a long time has been wanting to become militarily independent from the Americans. Japan for a long time has been wanting to advance its military innovation, all of that stuff. See, we always forget that Japan is a very nationalistic country and it's a very militaristic country. We always associate Japan with Pikachu and Pokemon and karaoke singing, sushi, wasabi, weird hotel rooms, bizarre animations. And while this is all true, Japan, with all of its weirdities, has something that's also quite dangerous, and that is its aspiration to becoming militarily independent from the United States. Because since the Second World War, there has been this rule that Japan really can't participate in war, and that America is the protector of Japan. There is a giant samurai sword sticking out from Japan, but the only one who can wield the sword is the United States. But over the decades, this rule has been disintegrating. And it really, after the Second World War, there came a point where the Americans were even talking about allowing the Japanese to have nuclear weapons. And this was all coming from the idea that Japan can be used as a proxy against the Chinese and also against the Russians. And this has been a part of the American psyche when it comes to Northeast Asia, going all the way back to Theodore Roosevelt after the Americans saw how the Japanese could take out the Chinese in the case of the First Sino-Japanese War, and also against the Russians in the case of the First Russo-Japanese War, when the Japanese defeated the Russians. Although the Japanese suffered a lot, technically the Russians lost the war, but it was kind of like I guess you could say it was a Pyrrhic victory because the Japanese had a very, very high casualty rate. With all of that said, Japan for decades has always been looking for opportunities to expand her military capabilities, but also to transgress against that post-World War rule against war. In other words, Japan has always been looking for opportunities to break the shackles of pacifism, which the Americans have been imposing on that country since the end of the Second World War. But the Americans are also relinquishing their control over Japan and allowing Japan, enabling Japan really to move further and further towards this goal of military independence. And there are a lot of these lobbyist types and political analysts in DC who will say things like, well, yeah, Japan should be allowed to have nuclear weapons and all that stuff. There was a guy by the name of, I think his name was Roger Robinson, and he was a part of some big think tank group with ties with the CIA. Center for Security Policy, that's the name. So this guy, Mr. Robinson, years ago, I think this was back in 2017 or something, but this Roger Robinson guy even went so far as to say in a speech that Japan should be allowed to have nuclear weapons. And you can say, well, Ted, this is some crazy American neoconservative or whatever, but let's not forget that the neocons, the neoconservative types, their mentality still has a strong presence in America's foreign policy. And we can even see this in people like Donald Trump. Remember, when Donald Trump was running for the presidency, what did he say in regards to North Korea? He said, hey, if the Japanese want to nuke North Korea, then so be it. You're seeing that mentality manifesting into reality in regards to America's foreign policy towards Japan. And so you're seeing the Japanese talking about, well, we should have the ability to do preemptive strikes against our enemies. And that is completely contrary to, it's completely contrary to the whole idea of not being allowed to partake in war. Japan can only participate in self-defense, and only in conjunction with the United States being its protector. So the idea of Japan doing preemptive strikes is completely contrary to the post-World War II era, or the post-World War II order, I should say, and is actually pushing Japan back to its World War II state, when it was attacking countries. not in the context of self-defense, but in the context of an offensive war. In the case of Japan invading Korea, in the case of Japan invading China, in the case of Japan invading the Philippines and other parts of Southeast Asia, those were all wars of imperialism and expansionism, and they also entailed a tremendous amount of genocide, experiments on human beings, and other pretty horrendous things. So here we have a country called Japan with a very long history of expansionism, imperialism, and genocide. And the United States is saying, yeah, Japan, yeah, go ahead, pursue all these things. It's okay. The Japanese want to have the capability to fire at land targets in China and also other parts of Asia. And there is an article about this that came out today from UK Reuters, and it says right in the beginning of this article, months before he announced his resignation, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe set in motion a policy change that could, for the first time, allow Japan's military to plan for strikes on land targets in China and other parts of Asia. And it goes on to say, it goes on to present a quote from Masahisa Sato, who is a lawmaker from Shinzo Abe's ruling Liberal Democratic Party. And Shinzo Abe is no longer the Prime Minister of Japan. The new Prime Minister of Japan is going to be another nationalist fanatic by the name of, I think his name is Yoshihide Suga. And that guy is a complete fanatic, and he's no different than Abe. He may actually be even worse than Abe, because from what I have read about him, this guy had a tremendous amount of influence over the Abe administration. He had a tremendous amount of influence in the government's control over the press, controlling the press, preventing the press from exposing government scandals. The Japanese government is just riddled with these nationalist, fascistic types of people. These are Japanese ethno-nationalists, and that is why Shinzo Abe was a member of a cult called the Nippon Kaigi, and he got well connected with that cult thanks to Yoshihide Suga. And this cult wants to revive emperor worship in Japan. So the people who are controlling the Japanese government, these are fascist, these are ethno-nationalists, these are people who want to revive the imperial religion of Japan, the one that inspired the Japanese Empire during the Second World War, in which the Japanese committed genocide and conquered its neighbors, and it was really, really horrific. So this Masahisa Sato guy, who was a part of this right-wing political party, which has been in power over Japan for a very, very long time, decades actually, he said that, quote, "The main reason for our action is China. We haven't really emphasized that too much, but the security choices we make are because of China." Now, if they said, well, we want to have these capabilities because of North Korea, that narrative would be actually more accepted, because everyone agrees that North Korea is an unstable, capricious, and untrustworthy country, right? Everyone can agree with that. But he says China. Now, China is a country that has business dealings all over the world. It is it's a wealthy country technically, but the quality of life in China is nowhere near as good as that in Japan or South Korea. But nonetheless, China is a country that can be controlled. Walmart can shut China down just by not buying Chinese products. So China is a country that can easily be controlled. It's not this huge threat that the right-wingers want you to think it is. It's a very corrupt country. It's a country that steps all over freedom, religious freedom especially. I sounded like such a neoconservative when I said that. It steps all over freedom. I sound like one of those guys who says things like they hate us for our freedoms, but what I meant by that was that the Chinese don't respect the idea of religious freedom. But nonetheless, China is a country that is easily controlled. The Japanese, on the other hand, they have a tremendously large economy. Now, they'll say that the Chinese economy is bigger than the Japanese economy, but the wealth in China is nowhere near as distributed as it is in Japan. The quality of life in Japan is higher. The average monthly wage in Japan is way higher than the average monthly wage in China. I think the average Japanese person makes like 4,000 a month, 5,000 a month or something like that. In China, most people live in utter poverty. So the quality of life in Japan is much higher, which means that there is more innovation, which means that there is more industrialization, which means that it's just a more powerful country, because where you have a high industry, you also have a higher military capacity, which means you're actually more dangerous in warfare. Japan also has a very long history of militarism and imperialism, much more so than China. Yes, China did have wars with other countries. Yes, China has had wars with its neighbors, but the Chinese are nowhere near as capable in warfare as the Japanese are. We saw this in the first Russo-Japanese War. We saw this in the Second World War. We saw this also in the First World War, where the Japanese was an ally of the United States. Took a big chunk of China from the Germans. So Japan is much more militarily capable than China. The question that I have is, why do they want to hit the Chinese? It's quite obvious why the Americans want the Japanese to go back to militarism, because the Americans think that they can use Japan as a proxy against the Chinese. Again, the Cold War hasn't really ended all that much, and America's Cold War policies are still continuing, although under different pretexts. The problem is that the Americans think that they can control the Japanese. It's kind of like the Mujahideen. The Americans thought, well, we can use the Mujahideen against the Soviets. And it worked. The Mujahideen helped destabilize the Soviet Union. But the Americans had the wrong idea of trying to control the Mujahideen. They thought that they could control it. They thought that they could contain it. It turned out that wasn't really the case. And we lost control over a lot of the different factions of the Mujahideen and things like that. So the Americans think that they can control the Japanese, just like they thought that they could control the Japanese after the First World War. They tried to force the Japanese under the gold standard, and that worked for a little bit, but the Japanese eventually left the gold standard and went to the silver standard. Why did the Japanese leave the gold standard? Well, it was a way to rebel against the Americans. The Americans also thought that they could put the Germans under the gold standard, and that didn't work either, because the Germans eventually left the gold standard. After the Second World War, the Americans thought that they could do the same thing again. They could force the whole world under the gold standard. And that worked for a while, but eventually the Europeans took advantage of the system. They were abusing the system. I think it was like, I forget what was the exchange ratio, but the French would do, or the French or one of those European countries would do things like, here's a ton of our currency, a ton of francs or whatever, give us a ton of gold. And they would destabilize the system that way. Eventually the Americans just pulled the plug on the Europeans, and then the Americans eventually left the gold standard as well. So now no one's under the gold standard. So that was one of the steps of the disintegration of America's control over the world. America thinks that it can control the world with the dollar. America thinks that it can control the world with its military. But this empire is declining, and it's declining because I think it's because America doesn't want to do all the work anymore. America's like, yeah, we were supposed to protect Europe. Yeah, we were supposed to protect the Japanese, or we are supposed to protect the Japanese. But what happened in Iraq? It demoralized the entire nation. What happened in Afghanistan? It demoralized the entire nation of the United States. Most Americans don't want to be involved in wars. Most Americans don't want to be policing the rest of the world. So this new zeitgeist that we're entering, which is really one of American isolationism, it's forcing American policy to dramatically shift towards allowing these big regional powers like Turkey, like Japan, like Germany, to become independent of the United States. The Americans are allowing this. That's why you're hearing from Germany talks about pursuing this plan of making Germany's military great again. You're hearing from Japan about pursuing military independence. You're hearing from the Turks talking about making their own military technology without having to get technology from the Americans. This is happening right now. It has been going on for quite some time now, but it's intensifying. And I think the Americans wrongly assume that they can control these regional powers. And eventually, what's going to happen is, well, exactly what happened before the Second World War, exactly what happened before the outbreak of that great global conflict. The Americans were the ones who, the Americans and the British especially, they were the ones who got Japan to become an industrial power. This is way before the First World War. And the Japanese, they allied with the Americans. But the Americans lost control over the Japanese. The Americans thought that they could control the Germans after the First World War. Gave them democracy. Got rid of the Kaiser. Did all these things. Gave the Germans a bunch of American money. That still couldn't control them. The Germans eventually went rogue and there was an outbreak of global conflict. So we are making the same mistake, and we are now returning to the consequences of those past mistakes. The world works in cycles. The world is not really linear. Like, we think that every situation is different from the past. And we look at events individually. We don't look at events in connection with past events. We don't see history as repeating. We don't see history as rhyming. We just see linear events that are transpiring before our eyes, when the reality is that what is going to happen is going to be something similar to what has already happened. The world works in cycles. And we are returning to another cycle. And it's going to be similar to what happened in the past, but it's probably going to be a lot more bloody, because we have become a lot more demented as people. And that's a really scary thought. Anyway, hope you guys have enjoyed this message. Hope you guys have learned something from this message. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.